From ELCA Advocacy, this is Here I Pod. There's so much happening in our communities every week and every day that are impacted by policies at the local, state, and federal levels. Here I Pod will focus on one aspect of what's happening each episode by talking with faith-based advocates, as well as providing steps that you can take in your own advocacy efforts. In this episode, our host Regina Banks speaks to Phoebe Morad, Executive Director at Lutherans Restoring Creation and Certificate Coordinator at the Center for Climate Justice and Faith at Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary, about their work providing churches with resources to have climate conversations that are rooted in faith. Following their conversation, the season concludes with a final special report from Hunger Advocacy Fellow Joey Chin, who spent the day with young adult climate advocates who had traveled to Washington, D.C. to meet with congressional offices. Here's Regina to get us started.
Hello, I'm so excited today because I get to have a conversation with one of my favorite humans here in this work, Phoebe Morad, Executive Director of Lutherans Restoring Creation and Certificate Coordinator at the Center for Climate Justice and Faith at Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary. Good morning, Phoebe.
Good morning. Good to see you. It's good afternoon here.
I'm
glad it's a good morning for you.
It's still a good morning out here. Hope is out for a good afternoon. So can you tell our listeners a little bit about who is Lutherans Restoring Creation and maybe a bit about the Center for Climate Justice and Faith at PLT?
Sure. I got to know about Lutherans Restoring Creation as a lay member when I had an infant in arms, and my pastor very nicely asked, even though I had an infant in my arms, hey, I hear there's a group of Lutherans hanging out by a camp that are concerned about the environment. I know you're busy, and I was like, oh, let me go. So I did have academic interest in the intersection of religion and politics and certainly environmentalism, but I also just needed some time away. What I didn't know, at the time, I just liked my church. I liked my pastor. I liked the community. I had no idea what ELCA stood for. No idea. So that's how kind of unchurchy I was at that moment back in 2010. And since then, I got to get together with this group of people that essentially it seemed to start from this wonderful seminary professor, David Rhodes, that had created a great curriculum along with some students to say, how do we weave in eco-theology and care of creation so that it's not this separate, stand alone in the corner, get a recycling bin and you're done type of movement.
Right.
And how do we not put it all on a pastor to do everything either from the pulpit or from their office? How can we have this as a movement just as integral as prayer is to church life? So with that curriculum that was shared in 2010 with us, and at the time it was like, wonderful theologian speak, but it was big. And I was a volunteer at the time. Very quickly, I wanted to get engaged. There were 30 to 40 of us that met in 2010. And we kept doing some more workshops and kind of distilling this curriculum down, and then noticing that it had little less to do. The foundation of the written word was wonderful from the seminary professor standpoint. And then once it got into the hands of the people in the field, we were able to learn more and more from each other about, okay, well, how does it work when you talk to your facilities manager about saving money? Or how does it work when you talk to your Sunday school team about having ecology-centered vacation Bible school? And over the years, it's emerged to be a bit more of a best practices, good stories type of network. And because we're grassroots, we get to kind of look at what the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, I did find out what that meant. Yeah, we were, all of us interested in this, were really impressed that there was a social statement that was written in 1993 about this stuff. But as a lay member, you don't know what is written and put on the shelves of social statements. So we considered our work to be being a reflection, a mirror, to say back to the ELCA, hey, we said this, what are we doing about it? So to use what the ELCA said and voted yes on, and bring that back to people in the churches, but also to the institution to say, we said this was important, so we would like to push the institution along with equipping congregations, equipping individuals to make this just part of a faith-filled life. So that in essence is what we do. So we're with the ELCA, but not of it, if that makes sense.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And because I got to do this work for about a decade, then when the Center for Climate Justice and Faith was emerging from Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary, I was a little starstruck to get a phone call from Professor Cynthia Molabita, who had written a book I thought was really cool. Yeah. And I told lots of people about it. And then she's calling me saying, hey, you're with Lutherans Restoring Creation. We're thinking about having a certificate for the rest of us, like for people that aren't going to drop everything and go to seminary, but want to weave in this daunting existential problem to their faith work. And that's how the certificate program has emerged as a totally, we first got together in 2019, just pre-pandemic. And we were looking around saying, well, we'd like to gather people from across the globe and we don't want to spend carbon doing it. But who would really get on Zoom? And that was pre-pandemic.
Pre-pandemic. All right.
It's changed. So, and now we have 30 to 40 people gather every year from across the globe as small cohorts to think about how to be small group leaders or make small pockets of change, kind of like an immune system working in context right on the ground. How do you implement a lot of what we talk about with creation justice, and what do we talk about? How do we implement it where you are?
So you mentioned that Lutherans Restoring Creation has evolved into a cohort of sharing best practices. Can you give us a couple of the items that you have discovered in that work?
Yeah, I would, when I think about, instead of there are lots of practical little snippets of stories, but overall, the kind of shared knowledge that keeps coming up to the surface is that you really can't depend on one person. And it can't be egocentric, because if it's all about you, you're not listening to anybody else. And then you're in competition with your World Hunger Team or your food pantry or it can't be in competition. We use the word intersectional a lot, and that you can see in the problems in the world, like how droughts will cause poverty and hunger. And, so climate change can lead to all of these intersecting issues. But there can be lots of shared solutions as well. So we don't have to arm wrestle over who's going to take care of what. We can just try to brainstorm more often. Okay, we are losing money and funds and can't afford to pay to have the lawn taken care of anymore. So how about we open it up to community gardens? Or how about we let it go to a pollinator garden? Or, we're having trouble opening up the space to community members. How about we show up at more events in our community? So those kind of things, recognizing that green teams aren't about just calling a meeting and trying to get as many people to show up to your Zoom or coffee hour as possible. It's more about equipping, and it's more about listening, equipping people with ears, essentially, to listen to creative ways to see how kind of your ecological ethic can help whatever else is going on in your community, like wherever else the passion is or the need, how you can just help that flourish with layering on an ecological lens.
So can I ask you a little bit more detailed? How do you do that? Because I 100% agree. If it's one person's side project, then it is that one person's side project. And if they get tired, or if they leave, or if they however they come to not do it anymore, then the congregation isn't doing that, or the synod isn't doing that anymore. So how do you integrate the work of climate justice into the life of a congregation or into the life of the synod?
So some of the first steps that we ask people to take is to talk to one another. First off, to bring up the subject. And that's where some of our national partners have helped a lot, Eco America is a big, well-funded nonprofit that helps I call them kind of our communication team, where Blessed Tomorrow is a part of that helps faith communities kind of build a bridge between the science of climate change and your faith community's values. So their communication language can help translate, why is this part of church work at all? So with some of their materials, it's helpful to bring up a conversation, even if it's like a 5-minute video about what's going on and some ideas that other churches have done. It starts to have a conversation emerge within a congregation. So they've offered some, kind of team group exercises, or like they'll offer a film altogether. So that's a way to get people talking. But ultimately, it's usually having something local. So if you're passionate about anything environmental, rather than starting at the church level, to go outside that circle and find out what's already happening in your community, and then ask your church to go with you to something else, just to kind of be really sent, I find to be one of the best first practical steps to listen to your community's needs. But starting maybe from, if you don't feel like you even have a couple people to go with you anywhere, we have done World Cafe methods. Are you familiar with the World Cafe method of talking? So I'll send a link that we can share later, but it's a nice, more casual way of having dialogues at tables that you can plan one within an hour after coffee hour, whatever. But each table will think about kind of a different angle of how could we think about ecology in facilities? How could we think about ecology as part of worship? The way that the World Cafe method, the parameters work, is that you get to hear from everybody at the table. And if they're not really a verbal communicator, I often have like markers down or Play-Doh or you leave space in different ways for people to share their information. Because typically, especially, I feel like those of us that go to church, it's set up with a whole bunch of pews and one pulpit. So when you go into coffee hour, it's hard to change that feeling of like being talked at. So I find that this World Cafe method helps sit people down, and they're not signing up to go to a meeting, right? They're not signing up for another responsibility or committee, or they're being asked to talk about something. And of course, it helps to have food there. That brings everybody to the table. But some really casual dialogue methods I've found to be the best to help conversations emerge, especially from the people that aren't heard from, or, they don't consider themselves like tree huggers. So why would they show up to this? But if there's a table and it says facilities and, operations, and they're the ones that are always buying things for the church, they're going to have some views on that and want to be listened to. And that's how you literally open up the table for everybody to be heard, and then rile stuff up.
Yeah.
So we do have some suggestions about how to do that, but how to listen to the members in your worship community that might not feel heard is a natural first step.
So I like that, the piece about hearing voices that would not ordinarily be heard. So I have two parallel tracks now that I would like to talk about. And one of them is, what is the part of Lutherans Restoring Creation? Like, tell me about your members. And then once we have that conversation, let's talk about young adult engagement, because across the church, that is the area where young adults say, we want to show up here. We are waiting for the church to show up here. No,
Right.
We're not waiting for the church to show up here. We're going to do it.
We're going to go in
church. So like that is a big discussion that's happening now. So
yeah, I have to admit that, because I've been a part-time, 15 to 20 hours a week executive director, and typical nonprofit under the radar. Most people don't hear about us unless they have to search for us type of thing. That means that we have our network itself is mostly those people that are like, why aren't we doing stuff? They're already all fired up. So the people that are proactively finding us, they're the folks that show up at our connections calls. And our hope is that during those connections calls, we help those like angsty, energetic folks be able to open their ears a little bit better to hear what's going on in their communities rather than like running out there and shaking people by the shoulders to say, so
I may be those people. Yes.
right. And sometimes we need a place to vent and that kind of thing. Where some people have called themselves the green sheep of their congregation. So we admit that we're a little bit of a silo there, but we want to be sent. And so sending people forth, and I will tell you too that the typical Lutheran American person is the typical Lutherans Restoring Creation person as well. And again, that's where, when we have connection calls, we have them in the evening. So we do try to solicit folks that are not the people preaching behind the pulpit so that we can get more people in the pews doing this, so it's not all on pastors. But also, since we've been able to hire now officially Gabrielle Earl, who comes from the YAGM, stands for Young Adults and Global Mission. Did I get all those?
Got it.
Okay.
Got it.
And so they've been able to bring this whole new, fresh understanding of, right, you have to go to where young people are, but also be seen doing stuff. Nobody cares what you're doing in that worship hall unless they see you doing what you talk about in there. So we've been able to be more and more engaged out of the typical worship circle and more in the activist circle. And what Gabrielle has been really excited about working with is that doesn't mean necessarily holding a protest sign, right? Like it means speaking to your representatives. It means talking about stuff like solar punk, which is, it's this whole other way of envisioning the future and asking people to do art and really imagine a greener, better future. But the other thing that I've found interesting about working with Gabrielle, again, because Gabrielle's like a new Lutheran, which is wonderful. What I feel is important about having Lutherans restoring creation is that there is some great writing and theological foundation for this whole concept of saint and sinner at the same time. And all of the concepts of not having self turned into self. They're great writings that can help the rest of the secular environmental movement, right? But we can't stay there in the writings. We don't have enough time to just stay there and keep pondering this intellectual stuff. We need to talk about it while we're on the road. And that's what Gabrielle has been able to really bring to this movement. So I'm really excited about that.
Okay, so you just led right into the next piece.
Oh, okay.
We don't have enough time. And I'll be really honest with you, because we've had similar conversations like this before. And while you were talking about the cafe model and everybody gets a chance to talk and you bring markers, I think that's great. Did you see a picture of the floods in Texas? Did you see, like, the first thing that you asked me when we came on getting ready for this is, am I near the fires here in California? I mean, like, the world is actively collapsing, and we are going to address that with markers and coffee. Like,
right.
help me scale my disbelief in that being
that's
way
going to be
forward.
part of the answer.
Yeah.
Right. What again, with what Gabrielle's been working on is working more and more with Lutheran disaster response so that this isn't seen as something like, oh, there are disaster teams and then there are green teams over here. And then there are these things over here. It's the same people that want to see church in the world that will show up to the scene of a disaster. They're not going to sit there and talk about how climate change is. They're going to help. They're going to help with their hands.
Right.
And yet when the fires aren't there, or when the fires aren't going on where you happen to live, the idea that we need to be part of the conversation and changing the cultural attitude of, oh, well, it's just what God wanted. Like, how is our work God's work, our hands? Changing the conversation too at a more radical level, as far as what does our capitalist system have to do with how we care for one another? So how are these things on an ecological plane, but also on a incarnate conversation about Jesus Christ? How are we also connected? So that part of the conversation being important, and the fact that, like, having people express themselves through art, I do find as one of the critical components to get out some of that radical understanding that it's not about a recycling bin in the corner of your church. It's about changing our culture and recognizing that part of our work in the world is to be evangelists against greed, against corruption, against all of these things. And what does going to church have to do with that? It only has to do with that if you're able to see the connections with one another, but also how, me buying an EV car doesn't necessarily solve any problems if all of the components of that car were mined from a reservation where they didn't have any rights to say whether or not they wanted that, or their water was despoiled doing that. So if we just keep fixing each individual problem and don't talk about this as a cultural issue, we're just gonna keep kicking the can down the road. So while like doodling with markers and stuff might not seem like a direct line, you might hear from those people that have that in their mind and are ready to do that work, but are certainly not going to run out in the streets and say anything. And that is what I hope we get sent out of church doing more and more often. What are you going to do that's uncomfortable this week? And because fortunately or unfortunately, those people that are miles away and don't see the smoke from the fires, see it on TV, then turn it off, might say a prayer, but like don't really know what else to do. But the fact that it is all ecologically and incarnately connected, I do think that we have something else to do about it. So that's not to like practically answer your question, because I do feel like when you see fires outside your window, you're like, stop freaking playing with arts and crafts, guys. But at the same, yeah.
Because this is a podcast that comes out of ELCA Advocacy, is advocacy a piece of your strategy at Lutherans Restoring Creation, or is that a separate deal that you leave to others?
What has been wonderful over the years working with ELCA Advocacy is that advocacy, the whole team really, because I know you work with many different ministry sections, and you give us the language that we're able to then translate on the ground, and that people can see where God is when typically there's just this barrier of policy and jargon. And so the ELCA Advocacy Office, I find, really gives wonderful language to help us translate. We as a church have always said this, and this is what's going on right now. Whereas if we look at mass media, it's really hard to translate that. We have a Coffee with Christine. I don't know if you've ever seen that, but what Christine really likes about that, as being the energy and environment person, is that, yes, she can help say what's going on and coming down the pipeline without writing stuff down, because we know how fluid that is. But she can also, again, hear stories from people in the field, or just some good either commiseration, prayers. Like there's also that sense of community that's built between our teams. The other part that I find helpful about having an advocacy office is that, I don't know about you, but I find that there are just so many things to click. But seeing your face, seeing Christine's face, seeing people there representing our church, and having to travel halfway across the globe to show up is huge. And we can't all do that. And we really appreciate that you do. And I don't think we all should do that. But the fact that someone is and takes our stories, but more importantly, helps amplify the other stories that you hear back to those people in the pews. Yes, it's critical.
We turn a bit to the website and the climate change in the pews. So I really appreciate Lutherans Restoring Creation, your website. I know that you've done some recent updates and changes to it, but I think it's really a great resource for people. Can you tell us a little bit about what's new and exciting there?
Sure. On our website, we do like to say that we're kind of a mirror of what's going on out there. So sometimes the website can just be overwhelming, like it's glaring. There's a lot. So we do understand if people just need to call us and want a tour, or just want to pinpoint what information you're looking for. Our church members are very concerned with drought and agricultural decline. They're very concerned with natural disasters. They're very concerned with all of the impacts of climate change. And they believe that climate change is happening, but they don't believe that anyone else is talking about it, or that anybody else cares. So that's what Eco America's Blessed Tomorrow helps, like with these surveys that come out. Like, churches don't know how to talk about it, and don't think anybody else wants to talk about it. And especially pastors are concerned about bringing anything that might be considered political behind the pulpit, right, to the pulpit. So when we hear this from the field, we also recognize that, okay, it's kind of similar to death, that nobody wants to talk about death, but thankfully churches haven't shirked away from that too much, right? I know some of us do, but this is a really big deal to us and where church belongs in the conversation. So our views from the pews are trying to lift up the idea that we do have ways to equip each other, but we need to tell each other about them. There's no one website that will have it all. It doesn't matter as much as you telling the person that you're a coffee hour with, or your pastor feeling equipped to see how the lectionary for the week does speak to creation care, which again, we do have those resources on our website, but no one's going to go there unless you bring it up, right? So to be able to have conversations first that might lead to the resources on our website is what our hopes are. And that does lead me to also want to lift up that we have Actions Speak Loudly is a program where it's the same curriculum that I talked about at the beginning of the Lutherans Restoring Creation story, but we've put it on a shareable platform. So you can kind of go through in a half hour and say, all right, church members, any of you interested in doing this step? Let's try this. Let's try that. And once you hit submit, it'll pop up and show with, I think, 700 actions on there thus far listed.
Yeah.
And there are other ideas there that you might not have thought of, or look, there's a church that's in your synod that you didn't know is also doing this. So that Actions Speak Loudly board is meant to help people figure out, okay, I can only be a small part of this picture, but I want to be a part of this picture, and how can we? And it immediately links people to all those places on our website where, it helps you. All right, these are my next steps. What can we do here? And then leads you to some good resources otherwise. So that's what I'd like to highlight on our site. But the site is meant to get you to meet people. We want you online for a minute to get offline to talk to people in real.
According to the report, older and younger members sometimes see climate care differently. But what is the difference? And how can congregations create spaces that are intentionally intergenerational and take those differences in viewpoints seriously?
This is my assumption, not just based on testimonials, that typically I find older generations worked really hard on like recycling and waste management issues, right? And their top priority is, we figure this out, we still need to get this information out there. However, that's only going so far. And the younger generations are seeing a lot more to do with especially air quality, extractive issues, more of the root causes of like capitalism leading to overconsumption. So it is interesting to me to find that more of the conversations and younger groups of people are a bit more radical, really root centered than, the products thereof. So when people get together in spaces, what I would like to encourage is that there is more of a intention to pass the mic to one another, which is why I like the World Cafe method, because there's nobody at the front of the room. But there are lots of ways to do this. Typically, I've found that it works when you combine the Christian ed teams and like the, whatever you might call it, but like the baking squad or whatever. People who work on the food prep at your church, whoever that is, if you can get them together to think about where does your food come from, usually food conversations, not just bringing food to an event, which is always good, but conversations about food and where our food comes from seems to be the most natural progression of a nonpartisan, faith-fueled conversation. So that's where a lot of our work that goes into food, faith, and farming kind of connections, those seem to be the most life-giving. And in my own church setting, I've found older people that came from agricultural areas are able to talk about their land ethic, whereas urban dwelling young people are able to talk about their farmers market that they just found, where those things come together and hear the stories from each other. So that's one example.
Phoebe, where have you seen the gospel recently in your work?
Well, I'm just gonna, from the most specific thing that I've seen was just sitting in church yesterday morning. And that is my pastor speaking. I'll give a shout out to Pastor Emmanuel. Speaking immediately to God's mercy for all of us. And as he's speaking about God's mercy to all of us and how many conflicting views we have, and to see not only, again, it was the Good Samaritan story yesterday. And oftentimes we're thinking about who is the neighbor, like who's our Samaritan, but are you the Samaritan, and how are you as a good neighbor? And I'm sitting there thinking, okay, how am I there as a good neighbor? And someone in front of me in church is shaking their head and really upset that he's talking about immigration and politics. And she was really upset. And that's where I saw the gospel. And then we turned around and gave hugs for God's peace, right? Like that was our mercy to one another. And I've seen her shake her head and be upset before, and she keeps coming. And I need to be in community like that, where we're not all the choir. We didn't all sign up necessarily for the same thing. That's where I really find the gospel being unsettling. Yeah.
Phoebe Morad, Executive Director of Lutherans Restoring Creation and Certificate Coordinator at the Center for Climate Justice and Faith at Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary. It's been amazing as always, Phoebe.
Thank you so much.
And now we'll hear a special report from Joey Chen and a group of young adult advocates.
On a Sunday morning in mid-July, 9 young adults gathered at Luther Memorial Place Church in Washington, D.C. for worship. The 9 young adults were gathered for the ELCA's Young Adult Climate Advocacy Immersion Trip. The trip, which was jointly planned and organized by ELCA Young Adults and the ELCA's Witness and Society Office, brings together participants to engage in the work of federal advocacy in Washington, D.C., and also advocacy at the United Nations in New York. After Sunday morning worship, Kayla Zotfi, the ELCA's Young Adult Networks Coordinator, offered participants a word of encouragement from the book of Job.
There's a text in Job where there's a young adult named Elihu who waits for Job's friends basically to help him figure out why is suffering happening? What does suffering mean? And Elihu jumps in and he's like, okay, I was waiting for all these old people to speak because they say with age comes wisdom, but actually none of you have given anything good for me to latch on to. And so now I'm going to speak, and not because I'm young, but because it is the Spirit of God in somebody that makes them wise, and we all have the Spirit of God in us. So I invite you in those times to go back to the Spirit of God in you as wise people.
The next day, participants visited the ELCA's Washington, D.C. Federal Advocacy Office to get ready for their meetings with congressional staff. I followed a group to the Longworth House office building and had a chance to speak with Satara Jacobs, a photojournalist and community activist from North Carolina. How are you feeling going into your meetings?
I'm feeling excited and nervous, but excited, and just really honored to be in this space. People of color, this whole system really wasn't built for us, and so it's really just a blessing to be able to be in this space, with my ancestors who have came before me, and just really trying to take it as, not trying to take it for granted, but also understanding, but just being here is still a part of the puzzle.
I also had a chance to check in with Katie Evans, a DC resident and ELCA deacon, before her meeting. Going into some of your meetings today, what are the things you want to make sure you discuss and talk about?
Yeah, I think I want to highlight the need for refunding the Office of Refugee Resettlement and the way that government overreach and federal funding has really affected people losing their jobs and in turn harming the people that they're already serving. So I lost my job in February. I was working for a Church World Service doing refugee resettlement work. And so I lost my job after an executive order. And then in turn, almost my entire office did as well. And now we can't serve the Afghan and Ukrainian families that were in need of assistance. And so I will be asking, like, as a person of faith, as somebody who cares about the climate and recognizing that this issue of migration and refugees is only going to increase as climate change increases as well, then there's really a need for a stable system for migration.
How are you feeling going into your meetings today?
I'm excited and nervous. I said earlier I was nurse-sided. Feel honored to be able to share my story, but there's also a lot of vulnerability in that.
Participants engaged in a total of 9 different meetings with Senate and House staff throughout the day, discussing a range of topics related to the impacts of climate change. After meetings, I went back to the office and asked Katie Evans about her reflections from the meetings that she was in. How are you feeling reflecting on the experience that you had today?
Yeah, I think doing something like this really helps with the feeling of like hopelessness or helplessness. I feel like I've been feeling that a lot recently with things that just keep piling up of policies that just don't reflect my faith or how I feel we should be to human beings. And so in this sense of like even just going and affirming the work that people are trying to do helped me feel like I had a role in the work, a role in the process, I guess, too.
I feel like you already sort of answered this, but would you be willing to like expand a little bit on how your idea of hope is integral to the work of advocacy?
Yeah, I have been reflecting a lot of like advocacy as a spiritual practice and just like faith as a journey, advocacy as a journey, in the sense of my faith isn't based on outcomes. It's like based in the action and the practice itself. And so I look at it as putting my body, putting my spirit in this mode of like repetitive practice, of spiritual practice. I talked yesterday of like, not every prayer feels super close to God, but I'm going to just do it. And then maybe the next time I'll feel a little bit closer. But it's like getting your body in that space of rest or that space of receiving where the spirit might be leading feels very applicable to advocacy as well. Change doesn't happen in a day, just as like faith is an ever evolving thing. And so if that change doesn't come, if that prayer isn't answered, that doesn't mean that faith is lost or hope is lost.
I also had a chance to check in with Satara Jacobs and specifically wanted to ask her about her conversation with staff from Senator Tom Tillis's office about her time living in Palestine as a young adult in Global Mission. In the meeting with staff from Senator Tillis's office, I think you said something like humanity is at stake or something like that after telling your story. And I thought that was really simple, but also really profound. I don't know if you prepared that ahead of time or that just came out after you're done with your storytelling, but I think they appreciated the stories with sort of that ask and that framing.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things that I try to, especially when talking about my time in Palestine, is just I try to tell simple, relative stories and really show the humanity of who they are. And especially being a photographer as well, I try to focus my imaging on that. And because we see a lot of imagery in conversations of just them being in distress, but we don't hear a lot about the joy that they have and the ways they just kind of do day-to-day life like everybody.
It reminded me a little earlier this year, we did like a training, I guess it was, or it might have just been a meeting on like framing stories about refugees. And they were talking about how it is important to highlight the pain and the trauma and the struggle that they go through. But there was this one story about a refugee who like loved listening to Beyonce, and they thought that was so important to tell that part of the story because it emphasizes their humanity in a way that simply focusing on the pain doesn't and makes it more reductive. And I feel like there's a certain balance we have to meet, but I appreciated you also sharing that in the meeting. I thought that was really great.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll just say you're talking to one of the biggest Beyonce fans ever. So yes, that is true. And so just being able to again bring in that relatability of like, man, like, I have a friend who listens to Beyonce, or, I have a grandmother who does these things or who would love to do these things. And so I think that's a big part of it.
Now that your meetings are done, how are you feeling about the day and the time you've had here so far?
Honestly, I'm feeling very charged up. I feel like I want to go have more meetings tomorrow or the rest of the day. Earlier I think I was pretty nervous, but I think there was just this moment where I was walking around by myself. And I was like, you know what? I belong here. Like, what? Like I'm just all dressed up, walking around, and like people were asking me, oh, hey, do you know where this is? And I'm like, okay, I must be walking with assertiveness. Like I'm supposed to be here. So it felt very empowering, very inspiring, especially as a person of color, just being able to walk in spaces that weren't really meant for us, but that I'm able to be in, and being able to walk and speak for people of color and continue the journey to collective liberation.
Many of the young adult advocacy immersion participants reflected on how they would take their experiences from Washington, D.C. back to their churches and communities at home to continue the spiritual practice of advocacy. If you are a young adult interested in climate justice, visit ELCA Young Adults on Instagram and visit their bio to get more information on the newly formed Young Adult Climate Justice Alliance. And if you are interested in the work of advocacy at the state, local, or federal level, consider seeing if your synod has an existing advocacy group or talk with people in your synod about potentially starting one. And lastly, if you would like to bring a group to our Washington, D.C. Federal Advocacy Office to hear more about the work that we are doing and to join us in engaging in the work of advocacy, email washingtonoffice@elca.org. Thank you for listening, and thank you to our 9 ELCA Advocacy Immersion participants who offered their invaluable experiences, stories, and perspectives for the work of advocacy and shining a light for peace and dignity.
Thank you to Phoebe Morad, Joey Chen, and all the young adult advocates who contributed to this episode. Kayla Zopfi, Cedra Jacobs, and Katie Evans. This concludes this season of Here I Pod. You can find links to Lutherans Restoring Creation, as well as all the resources mentioned by Joey, in the show notes. If you want to contact us, you can email us over at elcaadvocacypodcast@elca.org, or leave us a voicemail at 866-740-3522.